The revised title is actually Stephen Hawking's Evolutionism, the Religion that Offers Nothing, since I consider him to be the chief high priest of the great religion of nothing. Now, Stephen Hawking, of course, has been lionized in the media. He is seen to be, a hero in that he has struggled against ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. He has certainly beat the odds. When he married his wife, who actually is a Christian, she was told he only had 2 years to live. The Bible says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, but I think she wanted to lead him to the Lord and figured, well, maybe I'll have 2 years to give it a shot. But he's now 72. It's been more than 50 years, so he has certainly beaten the odds. The fact that he's still alive, I hope, is for the grace of God to reach his heart. Now, Stephen Hawking, of course, in the media is one of these iconic figures. He's certainly the most famous living scientist in the world today. Of course, the wheelchair gives him away. He even says that. I can't go anywhere, even with a wig and dark glasses. The wheelchair gives me away wherever I go. So he doesn't try to disguise himself anymore. But he is definitely recognized by more billions of people on this planet than any other currently living scientist. Perhaps the only in history that would outclass him as far as recognition would be Albert Einstein and Sir Isaac Newton. So we have had many Discovery and History Channel episodes about Stephen Hawking. Last year, in 2014, they had this kind of biographic movie about him called The Theory of Everything. And it was fairly accurate in some of the things. They did seem to indicate in the movie that his wife divorced him, whereas in actuality, he divorced her. And probably one of the reasons was because she would not give up her Christianity, and he loved the praise of his professional colleagues, all of whom were pretty much devout agnostics and atheists. Anyway, he is lionized so much that he's almost given a heroic, iconic stature really beyond what any human deserves. I've seen on the internet where people say, well, Stephen Hawking has said some rather crazy sounding things in recent years, but you have to remember he's so much smarter than we are. And it may sound foolish to us, but he is just such an intellectual giant that we can't put anything he says aside, because it probably is so profound that we won't even recognize it's true for years to come. Well, there's a real easy way to deal with that logically. We can use a logical syllogism where we start with a valid premise and we reason through to a logically valid conclusion. The premise is that all scientists are human. Would anyone disagree with that? The second premise is that all humans are fallible. That is, they are capable of making mistakes. Would anyone disagree with that? You don't have to live very long to know that that is true. And certainly Stephen Hawking has made plenty of mistakes and admitted as much. So, since he is a human and all humans are fallible, the logical, inescapable conclusion is Stephen Hawking is fallible. He is not the be-all, end-all. His saying something doesn't necessarily make it true. But I find in the scientific community today, there are scientists who have reached such iconic stature that they actually believe their own rhetoric. They believe that if they say it, and they have the majority of scientists on their side to say it with them, somehow that makes it fact and truth and science. Of course, logically it does not. It's a violation of the logical law of a non sequitur. In other words, it does not logically follow that just because scientists believe something, or even the majority of scientists believe something, ergo, it therefore must be true. Again, the fallacy of logic is argumentum ad authoritarium, that if the authorities say so, the majority of authorities say so, therefore it is true, or argumentum ad populum, an argument addressed to the population or the majority, which would say that if the majority, especially majority of authorities or scientists say something, ergo, it must be true. But it is not valid. Why? Because all authorities and all scientists are human, and all humans are fallible. Reminds me of Abraham Lincoln. Once during his political stump tours, while he was campaigning for president, a heckler in the audience tried to trap him with a trick question. And they said, tell me this, Mr. Lincoln, if we call a sheep's tail a leg, how many legs does that sheep have? Well, wisely, Lincoln responded, sir, that sheep has 4 legs. Because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. And I don't care if you get all the authorities, and I don't care if you get the majority on your side, and I don't care if you get the majority of the experts and the scientists on your side, calling that tail a leg does not make it a leg. And calling evolution a fact does not make it a fact. Claiming that everything came from nothing does not make it so just by saying it's so. And it does not logically follow that because the majority believe in evolution, therefore it must be true. So we're going to see a lot of logical fallacies in this great religion of nothing that we're dealing with today. First of all, I want to quote the evolutionist geneticist Richard Lewontin, who is very honest and open in putting in writing what they really believe. They're not usually quite this honest. But he put it this way: understanding the materialist mindset. Remember, materialism is a worldview, philosophy, and religion. It's not something they can prove to be true. It is a all-encompassing philosophy that says, without proof, and is believed by faith, that the material universe is the whole of reality. There's nothing beyond matter and energy. That's it, and the natural laws that control matter and energy. And therefore, there is no spiritual dimension, and there is no spiritual creator, as if they would be able to prove that. You know, how can they prove that by the scientific method or by logic or any other way? You would have to have infinite absolute knowledge to prove a universal infinite negative, namely that there is no God and no spiritual dimension. But anyway, Richard Lewontin, he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs because we have a prior commitment. Oh, not because we have irrefutable scientific facts and laws of chemistry and physics and mathematics that prove it's true. No, we have a commitment. In other words, we have a religious faith. We're committed to this philosophy, this belief. Then he says it's a commitment to materialism, which is, by definition, a philosophy and a religion. Now, he admits that in the next sentence. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Well, then what is compelling them? He goes on to say, but on the contrary, we're forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. Now, a priori simply means prior to looking at any evidence, they've already jolly well made up their mind what they want to believe. Now, the real scientific method is a posteriori, not a priori, which means you look at the evidence first, then, a posteriori, after looking at the evidence, you try to formulate a theory, a paradigm, a model, a hypothesis to explain the data and to make predictions. And the theory that explains the data with the least number of problems and contradictions and actually makes predictions that are borne out by observation and science, that's the theory that's most likely true. But you don't make up your mind first and then say, now I'm going to look at the evidence and force it to fit my preconceived idea. Oh, thank you, brother. I actually have some water here, but never hurts to have more. You know, got to water the elephant. Okay, I'll put that right there so you can see I have it. Okay. All right. So he goes on to say it's an a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation. See, the rules of science, as they have redefined it, is that it's designed so that you can never get the answer that this phenomenon has to be explained by a supernatural, intelligent designer. That the laws of chemistry and physics don't work, they run the wrong way. That materialism has been tried and weighed in the balances, and it doesn't work. Ergo, there is only one other possibility, a creator. Now, they've defined evolution as the only scientific view for the express purpose of getting rid of creation out of the arena of competition. It's, you know, you can believe it if you're a weakling and you need a crutch, you know, because you can't face the cold, hard world in reality that we're just evolved animals, and when we die, that's it, you lose everything. You know, we came from nothing, our purpose is nothing. When you die, you get nothing. It is indeed a philosophy and religion of nothing. But they have defined science nowadays in such a way that creation is excluded by definition. The creator is eliminated by decree, not by proving he doesn't exist, but just by saying there is no other alternative. Now, there's a reason, a method to the madness. What is that? Well, according to the logical law of the excluded middle, if there are two, and only two possibilities to explain a phenomenon, then if you can show beyond reasonable doubt that one of those alternatives is false, the other remaining one must be true logically by definition. And when it comes to our origin, there really are only two basic possibilities. Either a creator was necessarily involved in our origin, at least to some extent. He was necessarily involved, or a creator was not necessary or involved at all. So either a creator was involved or not involved. Can anybody think of a third possibility? Well, there really is no third possibility. Either a creator was involved, at least to some extent, or didn't need to be involved at all, everything just happened by itself. Well, if we can show that the idea that everything just happened by itself, natural laws of chemistry, physics, chance, etc., we can show based on the laws of chemistry and physics and mathematics and experiments that it doesn't work, that it's a false idea, then the only remaining possibility must be true, and that is creation. Now, the only way for them to logically or supposedly logically escape that is to declare creation a non-competitor. You can believe it if you want, it's just a religious idea, it's not scientific. But the classic definition of science is the search for truth, whatever that truth may be, regardless of whether some people think it's religious or not. Since we cannot prove that there is no God, God and being a creator is at least a possibility, a potential realm of truth. It might well be that materialism doesn't work, and all the evidence certainly shows that. Therefore, a creator is the best explanation of everything we see, and it explains everything from the tiniest detail to the most grand and sublime of everything in the universe. It explains it. But many people don't want there to be a God. They don't like the competition. You know, they want anybody infinitely more intelligent than they are. They want to be the fount of all wisdom and the pearls of wisdom. Oh, if you need wisdom or counsel, come to us because we're so smart. We have all these PhDs. But if there is a God, their finite intellect makes them the ultimate pinheads compared to him. Why would anyone go to them when they can go to God and his word? So they don't like the competition, and they especially do not like the fact that as creator, he has the moral right to judge them at the end of their life for every thought, word, and deed of their life. That's their worst nightmare. They don't want that. They want to be their own God, make up their own morality, run their own life, and have no ultimate accountability to any higher power. The good news, of course, is that God would rather judge his Son in our place than judge us for our sins. So they don't need to fear the Creator. The problem is the Creator has this horrible, horrible law that they just can't live with. A law that says, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that horrible? Well, no, not really. But I'll tell you what, if you want to obey that law, it sure gets in the way of an awful lot of selfishness and sin in this world. How many people have made tons of money and got tons of prestige and political power by trampling on the rights of other individuals who are made in the image of God? If we really loved God and loved our neighbor as we should, the world would be so much better. But that simple command gets in the way of a lot of people's selfishness, and to get away from it in their own conscience, given by God, they know that's what they should do. But if they can sear their conscience with a hot iron and get rid of God, then they're free to do whatever they jolly well want to do. And that, I believe, is the real motivation for the religion of nothing, that says we came from nothing, our purpose is nothing. When we die, we get nothing, but let's eat, drink, and be merry, for we can enjoy our big party now before we die and go to oblivion. To them, that's the best life can be. That's what they want it to be. Anyway, I want to get up on my soapbox. Got to get done with this here. So, he's saying an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, or in other words, contrary to common sense, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Why? Because they somehow know by the scientific method or by logic that a creator cannot exist? No, they can't prove that at all. They don't want it emotionally, and they don't want it philosophically, and they don't want it religiously, but they can't prove it scientifically. But here again, they think if we say so long enough and loud enough and we get the majority on our side, somehow saying it makes it so. A horrific fallacy of logic, to say the least. Now, when we look at the dictionary definition of religion, in the Random House College Dictionary, we find that it is most basically defined as a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. Has anyone noticed that that happens to perfectly fit with the philosophy and religion of materialism? It is a set of beliefs that they can't ultimately prove to be true by the scientific method, and it states that the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe had nothing to do with any creator, even though they can't prove that that is true, and they hold that by faith. Also, the Supreme Court, in its definition of religion, The Supreme Court has said a religion need not be based on a belief in the existence of a supreme being. In the 1961 case of Torcaso versus Watkins, the court described secular humanism as a religion. Now, if you look at the Humanist Manifesto, they make it very clear they believe man evolved from a continuous evolutionary process. He was not created. They call themselves non-theists. Well, you know what? There's not a nickel's worth of difference between the definition of a non-theist and an atheist. They're essentially synonymous. And so when the Supreme Court declared their belief to be a religion, they're saying atheism, non-theism, is just as much of a religious belief as theism. We can't ultimately prove God by the scientific method. We can argue that the evidence is overwhelming in favor of belief in God, and there's plenty of historical evidence that God has not been silent. He has spoken through his prophets. He sent his son in fulfillment of prophecy like no other man in history, and he demonstrated his divine power through his son, and the most potent evidence of that being his resurrection from the dead, which declared him to be the Son of God with power. And we can argue that fair application of the known laws of legal and historical evidence in a court of law, the resurrection of Christ would hold up as a viable fact of history if people would just look at it with an open mind. So we believe that we have plenty of good reasons, as in a jury where there's no eyewitnesses of the crime, but there's a ton of forensic evidence showing decidedly on one side the scales tip. Man, everything points to this one culprit. And it's so overwhelming that we can say, even though there were no eyewitnesses and we can't reproduce it, in a laboratory by the scientific method, you can't repeat history at all. But you look at the evidence and you say it so overwhelmingly shows this is true that we would say it is a fact beyond any reasonable doubt. In other words, it makes more sense to believe it in the light of the evidence than to disbelieve it. And that's the kind of evidence we have for our faith in Christ as our Creator. The evidence is overwhelming if you look at it open-mindedly. It doesn't prove it in the scientific method, but it does prove it beyond any reasonable doubt to those who are willing to weigh the evidence and be honest about it. Now then, amazingly, even Satanism defines evolution as a religion. Roger Morneau, a former high-ranking Satanist, and by the way, you can look up his name on YouTube, he has quite a fascinating testimony. He understood, of course, that evolutionism is not a scientific fact, it is just a false religion. And Satan comes to kill, steal, and destroy. The main way he does it is to get you to believe something that's false. He doesn't care what religion you believe as long as it's not the true religion in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So any false religion will do, and he's a master of being, transforming himself into an angel of light and coming out with false religions. Notice he said that anyone teaching the theory of evolution is considered to be a minister of that great religious system, not a scientist, but a minister. He also said, every teacher of that theory is recognized by the spirits as a person of great value and receives a very special unction from Satan himself, giving great power to induce spiritual blindness. He also said, Satan considers the teachers of the theory of evolution to be so valuable to him that he assigns a retinue of fallen angels to follow that educator all the remainder of his life. You might wonder why. Some of the quotes you'll see today, you'll wonder how could anyone believe this nonsense that is being espoused today in the name of science? Well, it's because it's not just intellectual. There is a spiritual element behind deception. And we've seen that before in history. How did somebody like Adolf Hitler, he certainly wasn't a handsome man. He wasn't very successful. He only rose to the rank of corporal in World War I, and he was a failed artist. Yet he somehow rose to be the absolute master of his nation and led them into ruin. Well, he had a satanic anointing. How else can you describe? People who listened to his oratory, which was obviously demonically anointed, you'd ask him afterwards, well, what did he say that thrilled you so much? I don't know, but it sure got me riled up. It's like, didn't matter what he said. He would open his mouth and people would be persuaded. Well, I tell you, there's something beyond rationale, beyond just good oratory. There is a spiritual dimension, and these people use it very powerfully, unfortunately. Now, they labor under what I like to call the definition delusion. That is, that they have illegitimately defined materialism as science and truth, even though, ironically, they can't prove that it's scientific or true. And therefore, God and the supernatural are labeled unscientific and untrue, or at least irrelevant, because it's just religion and it's not even in the scientific domain. And that leads them to the false conclusion, often quoted by Carl Sagan, that the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Really, Dr. Sagan, could you please prove that by this scientific method to be true? You know, there is a bit of a problem. Again, science is limited. They vastly overstep their authority. Science can't give us infinite knowledge about everything. We can't even send out space probes, you know, to look at how things really are in deep space or what's hiding behind some of those galaxies out there. Maybe God is hiding behind one of those galaxies out there. In order to prove that he doesn't exist, you would have to have omniscience, all-knowing power, omnipotence, all power, omnipresence. You'd have to be able to travel throughout the universe at a flash and check behind every galaxy and make sure God's not hiding behind a galaxy. You'd have to have the ability to see in the spiritual dimension, because a lot of our physical instruments obviously can't detect this physical or this spiritual dimension that the Bible talks about. So you can't disprove the existence of God unless, ironically, you had the attributes of God. If you had omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, then you could say with absolute authority, there is no God. There's only one problem. It would be a self-contradiction. Because if you had those attributes, God would exist. It would be you. And if you are God, then God does exist. So it is a self-refuting fool's errand to try to prove that there is no God. We can't disprove him. We can't prove him in the scientific method, but we can argue that there's plenty of credible evidence that it makes it the most reasonable faith, and infinitely more reasonable in light of logic and science than the religion of nothing and materialism and evolutionism. Now, it gets to the extreme where these people actually argue that it doesn't matter even if all the evidence supports intelligent design and contradicts naturalistic evolution. For example, Dr. Scott Todd, an immunologist at Kansas State University, said in Nature magazine, the most prestigious science journal in the world, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer. Notice all the data, not just some of it, not just a majority of it, all of it points not to materialism, not to evolution, but to an intelligent designer. Does that count for anything? No, because in his view, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. Well, I'd like to know who in the Sam Hill died and changed, got bequeathed to them the authority to change the classic definition of science. The classic definition is the search for truth, whatever that truth might be. No limits. Science is not prejudiced, biased, bigoted. Scientists often are, but science is not supposed to be. It's supposed to be an open-minded search for truth in whatever realm there is potential truth. And it's at least potentially true that materialism is false. It's at least potentially true that there is a creator who had something to do with our origin. That is some of the most profound truth that could ever be embraced by the human heart, because if it is true, it has an awful lot to do with questions of who we are, why we're here, and where we're going. Some of the most profound philosophical questions the human heart has ever pondered. So we shouldn't exclude ourselves from an area of potential truth just because they've rewritten the rules and say, oh, we don't want to look in those areas. We emotionally don't like that, and therefore you're not allowed to look there either. Sounds like the Orwellian thought police. You can only think a certain way, you can only speak a certain way because we say so. Well, saying it so doesn't make it so. Now, to put this in perspective in a way that we can all understand, every year we have this big football game, the most famous football game in the year. What's it called? The Super Bowl. And at that Super Bowl, the teams with the best record are supposed to battle it out on the gridiron to prove who is the best team in the world, at least for that season. So say we have the Super Bowl, and it turns out to be an absolutely historic event in every way. In this Super Bowl, one team dominates the other team like never before recorded in the annals of the history of the game of football. One team runs up higher data on the scoreboard in their favor than ever recorded before, the highest score ever. And not only that, the other team doesn't score a single point. They have no data in their favor on the scoreboard. They do have something there, though, the biggest accumulation of negative yardage ever recorded in the history of the game of football. So by all the data on the scoreboard, That team lost worse than any team in history. The other team won more lopsidedly than any team in history. And yet, at the end of the game, these losers, the worst losers in history, instead of hanging their heads in shame and shuffling off to the showers in disgust, bearing the stigma of the worst performance in the history of the game, instead they run triumphantly onto the field, give themselves high fives, saying, man, we've triumphed again. Give us our Super Bowl rings. We're the world champions. Well, the crowd begins to boo and hiss. Say, what's the matter with you guys? I mean, your performance was pathetic. We're sorry we even came to watch you. You're a disgrace. Get off the field. They say, oh, you people in the audience don't know anything. You seem to be under the delusion that football games are won or lost by whoever can put the most data on the scoreboard in their favor. But we're here to tell you it has nothing to do with who has the most data, who has the most points. It all has to do with who is eligible. You see, when nobody was looking and nobody seemed to object, we took the official rule book of football and we rewrote it. And the main thing we did was we rewrote the first rule, which says that of all the teams in the world, only our team is eligible to play the game of football. Doesn't matter how talented and gifted and good at putting points on the scoreboard the other teams are, they're not eligible by definition because we say so. So we don't have to prove anything. We're right by definition because there's no alternative. All we have to do is show up on the field and we win by default because we're eligible and they're not. End of story. That may sound extreme, that may sound crazy and ridiculous, but that's exactly what's been happening in science. They can't compete in a fair contest, they'll lose every time. But if they can rewrite the rules of science so that a creator is excluded by definition and by decree without having to prove anything, they win by default, because even if all the evidence is against them, and it is, they're the only show in town. There isn't any other alternative to appeal to. Therefore, the logical law of the excluded middle does not apply to them because there aren't two possibilities. Their self-made, biased, bigoted, prejudiced definition of science says there's only one because they say so, and that's atheistic materialism, as if saying it makes it so. But that's exactly what they have done. Now, let's look at the Big Bang. According to the Handy Space Answer book, 15 to 20 billion years ago, a Big Bang or explosion occurred, creating the universe. The universe began as an infinitely dense, hot fireball, a scrambling of space and time, as if they were there to see it scientifically. Now, there are many problems with the Big Bang, which I discussed in one of my DVDs back there, but the biggest one is that it starts with something, not nothing. It starts with the cosmic egg, the singularity, this cosmic atom that supposedly had all the matter and energy, stars, galaxies, black holes, compressed into this tiny little cosmic egg that they say was smaller than a proton, as if they were there to see it. Now here again, how do they come to that conclusion? By an observation. The universe is expanding, okay? Who knew about that first? God. 17 times in the Old Testament, God says he is stretching out the heavens as a scroll, spreading it out as a tent to dwell in. That was revealed thousands of years before we had the technology in the 20th century to prove it was true, with the work of Edwin Hubble, for whom is famously named the Hubble Space Telescope. How did the ancient people know that? By divine revelation. No evidence that the Bible is uniquely divinely inspired with knowledge that was impossible for man to know until the 20th century. But the idea is because the universe is expanding, if we go back in time and time is reversed, it's contracting and all these stars and galaxies and black holes are contracting and their gravity gets so powerful that it pulls it into the ultimate mother of all black holes, literally. And from this tiny little black hole with all the matter and energy of the universe in it, it supposedly exploded and expanded, and we get the universe that we have today. Now, the Bible tells us that God created the earth on day one, which will not correspond with any Big Bang theory, and he created the sun, moon, stars on day 4, already out there, and then he has been stretching them from where they were. They never were in a cosmic egg. God was there, he saw it, he did it, he reveals the truth. He cannot lie. Men, on the other hand, have all the liabilities. They weren't there, they didn't see what really happened, they don't know everything, they do make mistakes all the time, and they have this nasty habit. They tend to lie like rugs from the days of their youth, okay? So I'm not going to trust them. I'll trust God who was there, did see it, and is so holy by nature, he cannot lie. He cannot deceive us about what happened in the past. Anyway, that's where they get this idea of the cosmic egg. Now that would be the other, literally, mother of all black holes. But Stephen Hawking himself is famous for proving that even black holes leak radiation over time. In fact, it's named after him. It's called Hawking radiation. So black holes obey the second law of thermodynamics. They can't maintain themselves eternally. They lose energy through radiation leakage, which turns into entropy, unusable, unrecoverable energy. It's still there, but it's turned into an unusable form, and therefore they eventually will dissipate all of their useful energy and can't even blow up to be the Big Bang. So that means you can't maintain it eternally, therefore it had to have a beginning, therefore where did it come from, even if you believe in that cosmic egg? Well, to put it in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, which are incredibly important in science. In fact, Einstein said that the classical laws of thermodynamics would never be overthrown by the advance of science, and that has indeed proven to be true. Isaac Asimov, a very famous evolutionist scientist, said that the classical laws of thermodynamics are the most powerful generalizations that scientists have ever been able to make about the universe. So, you talk about pristine pure science, the first and second laws are that. No known exception, always in effect, under all circumstances, meriting the status of a law more so than anything we know in science. So what are the implications of these laws? Well, the first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy, and matter is just another form of energy, it's a coalesced form of energy, it's all really energy, that energy cannot be created or destroyed. That's why we have this flat, even line here. No matter what transformations take place in the universe, you never have more or less energy than you started with. So the book's always balanced, no matter what happens. You never have more or less energy. Another way of stating this law is that matter and energy cannot be created and it cannot be destroyed. It always stays the same as far as its amount. So the quantity always remains constant, as the straight line indicates, but the quality obviously does not remain constant. It is going downhill. And that is the province of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that with time, entropy increases. The measure of disorder in a system or the measure of unusable energy in any system is the entropy. So the quantity remains the same, the quality does not. Since the universe is irreversibly running down according to the second law, it will reach eventually maximum entropy. No more free energy to do any kind of useful work. Life cannot exist, machines cannot function, utter cold, dark stagnation. Now, the universe obviously still has a lot of free energy left. Therefore, it cannot be infinitely old. That means it must have had a beginning. So the second law says the universe must have had a beginning, but the first law says emphatically it could not have created itself by natural forces or natural law, because that primary first law says matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed by natural forces. But it certainly could by a transcendent supernatural source, such as a transcendent creator. Thus, we need a creator, whether they like it or not. Now then, even Stephen Hawking admits that in real time the universe has a beginning. He said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning. Well, thanks to the laws of thermodynamics, thanks to Einstein, who showed that space and time and matter are so intertwined that you can't have one without the other. If energy had a beginning, so did space and time. And so almost all scientists today believe, yes, the universe had a definite beginning. That's really something. The Bible declared that for thousands of years, but almost all pagan philosophers and scientists did not believe that. They believed the universe was eternal, and that may have been more chaotic in the past, but it was always there, eternally, and everything came from it. The Bible alone, Judeo-Christian view of reality, said there was a definite creation of space, matter, and time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, just like Genesis says. Finally, in the 20th century, our brilliant scientists caught up to what God's word already knew and told us. God's always well ahead of the curve. But this is very profound. It's not only a change in worldview that there was a definite beginning like the Bible says, but it means that the universe and everything in it falls under the most important law in all of science. A law so axiomatic, so self-evident, so critical, that the scientific method would not even be possible unless this law were true. Does anybody know that law? It's not the first and second laws of thermodynamics. It's not the Newtonian laws of motion or gravitation. It's not even the laws of subatomic physics, known as quantum mechanics. It is this all-important law, the law of cause and effect, which states that for every effect there must be an adequate cause, and no effect can be greater than its cause. If this law were not true, we couldn't even run the experimental method, because after all, certain variables could come into existence from nothing, and one experiment you run one day, get a result, and the next day you get a different result, because factors are coming into existence without any cause from nothing. It would make the scientific method impossible if this law were not axiomatically assumed to be true, In other words, self-evident. Furthermore, there is no known exception to it, which is why it has the status of a law and not a theory. Now, this law is so obvious, and our logical God has wired it into us that even children use this law without even thinking about it. For example, if I said, you'll notice there's a 20-ton bulldozer out in the parking lot in front of the building here. It wasn't there last night. Where'd it come from? And somebody says, you see that little ant, that particular one right there on the sidewalk, last night, that ant drug it all the way over here from Kent, Washington. Now, even a child would say, wait a minute, that ant doesn't have the power. It's not an adequate cause to lay hold of a 20-ton bulldozer and drag it all the way over here. Now, if you said the bulldozer pushed the ant over here, well, it would be overkill, but it would not violate the law of cause and effect, would it? No. So another way of stating the law of cause and effect is you can't give more than what you possess. You know, the ant can't give more power than what it possesses, ergo it is not an adequate cause to move that bulldozer, but vice versa is certainly true. So we have to realize that it's not enough to invoke a cause for an effect. We have to show it's an adequate cause. Now, Sir Francis Bacon, who was a Christian man of science, he said, and rightfully so, that true knowledge, in other words, science, which comes from the Latin scientia, or knowledge, true knowledge is knowledge by causes. Now, using the law of cause and effect, we can do a logical syllogistic chain of reasoning from a valid premise to a logically valid conclusion. The premise we're starting with is that everything that had a beginning requires a cause to explain its origin. Is that a valid premise to start with? Yes. It's basically restating the law of cause and effect. So from that, we say that point number one, the universe, including time itself, can be shown to have had a beginning, as even Stephen Hawking and Einstein agree with. Number two, it is unreasonable to believe something could begin to exist without a cause. See, the law of cause and effect doesn't have jurisdiction over everything. It only has jurisdiction over things that have a beginning. And our valid conclusion, number three, the universe, therefore, requires a cause, because they admit it did have a beginning. Not just any cause, an adequate cause to explain everything in it, from the most minute to the most powerful to the most sublime to man in this universe, with personality, intellect, emotions, free will, powers of abstract thought. We can think thoughts that were never thought before. We can invent machines and other inventions that never existed before. We can invent works of art that never existed before. We have a creative capacity, which makes perfect sense according to the law of cause and effect. If the ultimate, infinite, eternal, transcendent creator made us in his image, then we would be finite miniature creators, and it would make perfect sense that we have all these attributes, because he would be an adequate cause to give what he has in a smaller finite measure to us. We're made in his image. Now at this point, the evolutionists get a little upset. After all, we're invading their domain, supposedly. We're using science and logic to back them in a corner and show them they do not have an adequate explanation for the universe and everything in it. In fact, Richard Dawkins is very famous for saying, well, we easily dismiss this. I simply ask, who made the maker? Who created the creator? Who made God? And he thinks he's being very profound, but actually he has committed a logical fallacy, a self-refuting logical conundrum. His question is logically invalid because it's akin to this question. Please tell me, sir, to whom is this bachelor married? Anybody see a problem with that question? Well, the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. And to ask, tell me, who is the unmarried man married to, is a self-contradictory question and therefore invalid. God, by definition, is transcendent of space and time and natural law. He's not limited the way we are. And therefore, he's not under the domain or jurisdiction of the law of cause and effect, because it only has domain and jurisdiction over things that have a beginning. There is no law of science or of logic that says that something cannot be infinite and eternal, because you don't run afoul of the primary law of science, the law of cause and effect, unless you have a beginning without an adequate cause. But if you transcend time itself, the need for a beginning, then you're simply not under the jurisdiction of the law of cause and effect. So, God, as creator of time, is outside of time. Since, therefore, he has no beginning in time, he has always existed, so doesn't need a cause. However, they admit the universe did have a beginning. it is under jurisdiction of the law of cause and effect. They must, logically and scientifically, have an adequate cause to explain the origin of the universe and everything in it. Now, using the law of cause and effect, we can use a similar argument that was used by Aristotle thousands of years ago to refute the evolutionists of his day, because evolutionism is not a new religion or a new idea brought about by Charles Darwin. It's been around probably ever since the fall of man. But even the Greeks realized that time itself, logically, using philosophy, it had to have a beginning. See, if time was truly infinite and eternal, that means it would have no beginning and no end. That means no matter how many moments you go back into the past, you'll never reach the beginning of time. It's eternal. And no matter how many moments you go into the future, you'll never reach the end of time because it has no beginning, no end. It's just infinite and eternal. The Greeks argued that if that were so, then whether you come from the distant past or from the distant future and try to work back to this point in time here, you could never reach this point in time because you'd have to transgress an infinite number of moments to reach this particular moment, and no one can transgress an infinite number of moments. If, however, time had a beginning, a definite beginning, then you only have to transgress a finite number of moments to reach this moment in time. Therefore, they argued logically and philosophically, time itself must have had a beginning. Thanks to Einstein, we know that not only time, but space and matter also had a simultaneous beginning. So, using the law of cause and effect, we would argue that the first cause of endless time must have been something that was not under the dominion of time, therefore by definition eternal, outside of time but able to bring time into existence. It transcended time itself. And the first cause of boundless energy must be omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. The first cause of universal interrelationships must be omnipresent, or everywhere present. The first cause of supreme complexity must be omniscient, or all-knowing. The first cause of consciousness must itself be conscious. You can't give that which you don't have to give. In the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, in the question and answer period, someone said, well, tell me, Bill Nye, you know you believe matter and energy is the whole of reality. Matter and energy don't have consciousness. How then did we get consciousness if we're nothing but matter and energy? His brilliant answer was, well, I don't know. Well, that's a nice answer. We have an answer that makes sense according to the primary law of all science, the law of cause and effect, that says you have to have an adequate cause. It must itself be conscious in order to impart consciousness to us made in his image. Also, the first cause of natural laws must be a lawgiver. They talk about all these laws. Well, we don't get laws from nothing. They come from a legislator or a lawgiver. They don't come from nothing. Why should matter and energy obey laws if there's no lawgiver to give the law and uphold the law? As it says in Colossians, he upholds all things by the word of his power. He not only made the laws, but he sustains them and enforces them. Also, the first cause of moral values must itself have a moral nature, knowing the difference between right and wrong. The first cause of spiritual values must be of a nature that is spiritual. The first cause of human responsibility must be volitional or have the power of free will and free choice. The first cause of human integrity must be truthful. The first cause of human love must be loving. And the first cause of life must itself be living. You put it all together, by the law of cause and effect, the supreme law of all science, we would have to argue that the infinite, eternal, transcendent creator of this universe had to have these attributes in order to impart them to this universe and to the creatures that live there. It must be a living, loving, truthful, volitional, spiritual, moral, law-giving, conscious, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and eternal cause. Does that sound familiar to anybody? It happens to be the attributes of the God who is unique to the Bible. There is no other God like him. Amazingly, we did not quote the Bible to come to this conclusion. This God is revealed in the Bible, but we know scientifically by the primary law of cause and effect, such a creator must exist necessarily. Now, some evolutionists have said, well, if God is really so ethereal and transcendent and beyond the limitations of space and time, then us finite mortals can't really comprehend him, and if we can't understand him, we can't have any meaningful relationship with him. Therefore, even if he does exist, he's simply irrelevant. Well, they have a good name for that philosophy in Arkansas. Hogwash. It's pure hogwash. It's purely hypocritical. Can you imagine somebody saying, well, I'm not going to have any relationship with anything or anybody that I don't totally understand? Really? How many of you husbands here totally understand your wives? Honestly. How many of you wives totally understand your husband? You know, that doesn't mean you can't have a love relationship and a marriage with them. You don't have to understand everything, you just have to understand enough. How much does a little baby, a little child, understand about his mother? Well, she doesn't know she's bigger than me, where'd she come from, doesn't know. But he does know she loves me, she cares for me, she tends me, she shows me affection. What more do you need to know? God says right here that he is so high above us to an infinite, unfathomable extent that we can't fully comprehend him, but we don't need to, because he's revealed everything we need to know. He made us, he loves us, he died for us, he wants us to be adopted royal members of his family for eternity. What more do we need to know? Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to the Lord, but that which has been revealed belongs to us and our children forever. God has revealed all he needs for us to have a love relationship with him for eternity, and that's all that really counts. Now, believe it or not, nothing is the preferred cause of all things, not because science would lead them to this conclusion, but because their emotional religious philosophy wants to get rid of God at all costs. There's a name for these type of people in the New Testament Koine Greek. They are called mesotheists, haters of God. They claim he doesn't exist, yet they hate him. How can you hate someone who doesn't exist? That also is a self-contradictory logical conundrum. But I'm not kidding. Notice Alan Guth and Paul Steinhardt. Alan Guth, very famous at MIT for his inflationary aspect of the Big Bang Theory. He said, it is tempting to go one step further and speculate that the entire universe evolved from literally nothing. Why would it be tempting for a scientist of all people to believe everything came from nothing? Because if everything came from nothing, then we're accountable to nothing. There's no higher power to judge us. We can do whatever we want to do. See, it's an emotional attraction, not a scientific one. Also, we have the evolutionist cosmologist Edward Tryon. He said that our universe had its physical origin as a quantum fluctuation of some pre-existing true vacuum or state of nothingness. We know that almost sounds eloquent if it weren't so absurd. You know, nothing is literally no thing. You look up the dictionary definition of nothing, it says that which does not exist. How can that which has no existence cause anything, since there's nothing existing there to do any causing? I mean, a child could figure that out. It's not rocket science. I like Aristotle's definition of nothing. He said, nothing is what rocks dream about. Nothing. I don't think we all came from what rocks dream about. I mean, it's absurd on the face of it, but when you're so emotionally caught up in their religious fervor and the religious zealots of the religion of nothing, they'll say anything because they've got the majority on their side. And by golly, if we call a sheep's tail a leg, it makes it a leg. No, sir, it does not. How about some facts, evidence, and logic? Because you having the majority does not logically prove you're true. Let's have the truth. Now then, Paul Davies, notable evolutionist physicist from Australia, he said this quantum cosmology provides a loophole for the universe to, so to speak, spring into existence from nothing without violating any laws of physics. Sorry, mister, saying it doesn't make it so. It does violate the first law of thermodynamics big time. It violates the law of cause and effect. And it violates a law a lot of people ought to pay more attention to, the law of common sense, okay? So you see this ear? This is not a garbage bin. Don't stick your garbage in my ear. It's disrespectful. I will not tolerate it. You got some facts, some evidence, some logic, I'll listen to it. But don't just tell me it's so because you say it's so and the majority is on your side. That logically proves nothing. Now, we therefore have today the whole religion with the chief high priests of the religion of nothing. Chief high priest of them all being Stephen Hawking himself. And in his Discovery Channel series, Curiosity, the first episode was called, Did God create the universe? And his conclusion at the end is no. He came to the profound conclusion, everything came from nothing, so who needs God? Neil deGrasse Tyson has taken the mantle of Carl Sagan and redone, in modern terms, Carl Sagan's famous Cosmos television series. He, of course, also is a full-blown atheist, materialist believer in the great God of nothing. Lawrence Krauss wrote this book that was for quite a while on the New York Times bestseller list, A Universe from Nothing. Wow, you know, who would spend any money on a book like that? I don't know, but somehow a lot of people must think that's a brilliant idea because it was on the New York Times bestseller list. Richard Dawkins wrote the book, The God Delusion. Who needs to believe in God? We figured out this brilliant truth that everything came from nothing. And Paul Davies wrote the book, God and the New Physics, where supposedly some new understanding of physics allows us to do away with the old proven laws and just believe everything came from nothing because they want to. But again, saying it does not make it so. Lawrence Krauss, in his episode on the Discovery Channel under the title of How the Universe Works, he said, the philosophers in ancient times used to say, how can something arise from nothing? And what's amazing to me is that the laws, plural, the laws of physics allow that to happen. Really? Well, I'm not intimidated by him. You know, I've seen him on the internet, and when he talks with people, he says, you know, I have degrees in quantum physics and you don't. So whatever you say doesn't amount to hill of beans. I actually know what I'm talking about. Bologna sausage, okay? That's what I call it, bologna sausage. Now, you have to be careful how you abbreviate bologna sausage. But the Lord knows that bologna sausage by any other name is still bologna sausage just the same. So I'm calling bologna sausage on Lawrence Krauss. Doesn't matter if you have degrees in physics. Being an authority does not make you infallible. Being a scientist does not make you infallible. You can't use the authority card or the scientist card to trump logic, truth, and evidence. You claim there's laws, plural. Where are they listed in a physics textbook? How are these laws proven by experiment to be true? Just saying it doesn't make it so, and I listened to this whole episode on the edge of my seat waiting for him to tell me where these laws could be looked up. He never did. Bluff and bluster. I'm a scientist, just trust me. Sounds to me like the politicians. I trust them about as much. Okay, now, if he were pressed to give an example of something coming from nothing, he probably would have used the same argument Stephen Hawking uses, as he used in this Discovery Channel episode, Did God Create the Universe? Stephen Hawking said this, travel right down to the subatomic level, and you enter a world where conjuring something out of nothing is possible, at least for a short time. Really? Well, saying it doesn't make it so, sir. He also said that's because at the scale, particles, such as protons, behave according to the laws of nature we call quantum mechanics. Now he's throwing out some big names to make it sound like, boy, he's just so much more intelligent than you, so you can't challenge anything he says. But wait a minute. The laws of nature called quantum mechanics deal with subatomic energy and particles at the subatomic level. You notice there's no laws for how nothing does this or nothing does that. It's always about how matter and energy works at the subatomic level, not nothing. So I'm not impressed with that. He also says, and they really can appear, meaning these protons, at random, stick around for a while, and then vanish again to reappear somewhere else. Yes, but does that prove that they're appearing out of nothing? For example, light. Most of the spectrum of light is invisible to our eyes. Doesn't mean it's not there, it just doesn't appear to be there. But if you put on the right kind of goggles that allow you to see at the extremes of different wavelengths of light, then it would appear that all these things have come into existence, but really they were already there. So just because something appears doesn't mean it's necessarily appearing from nothing. Then he says, since we know the universe itself was once very small, smaller than a proton in fact, bologna sausage, Stephen Hawking, we don't know that scientifically. Nobody proved that by repeated experimentation and observation. That is an interpretation of the expanding universe, assuming you know what happened in the past that you never observed and nobody did. We don't know that. You believe that as a religion, sir. So please don't cram your religion down my throat in the name of science. I wasn't born yesterday, okay? So we don't know that as a fact. But he claims this means something quite remarkable. What on earth could it mean? It means the universe itself, in all of its mind-boggling vastness and complexity, can simply have popped into existence without violating the known laws of nature. Well, yes, it certainly would violate the laws of nature, like the law of cause and effect and the first law of thermodynamics. Saying it doesn't make it so. How can it be that laws are violated? How can laws be self-contradictory? What's the explanation for this? And do we even need this exotic explanation that something is coming out of nothing, or is there a much simpler explanation based already on known Einsteinian physics? Well, he doesn't want to seem to give us full disclosure in that regard. But first of all, there's a big logical fallacy here. It's the fallacy of over-extrapolating a small event and therefore assuming it can happen on a very large scale, okay? Over-extrapolation. For example, if I have a candlestick up here and I call up a young boy from the audience whose name is Jack, and I say, Jack, be nimble, Jack, be quick, Jack, jump over the candlestick. And if he's a normal, healthy boy, he will have fun jumping back and forth over the candlestick. Then I say, you have all scientifically observed that Jack can jump over the candlestick. Therefore, this also means that Jack can jump to the moon in a single bound. Would anybody dispute that? Would you dispute it if the eminent Stephen Hawking said it? Yes, because it's a logical violation. Just because a little boy has the strength to jump over a candlestick does not logically prove he can jump to the moon in a single bound. Just because something can happen on a very small scale does not logically prove it can happen on a large scale. So that's a logical fallacy there, for sure. But the real answer is in Einstein's most famous equation. What's his most famous equation? E equals mc squared. E, the symbol for energy, equals m, the symbol for matter. And it's telling us that matter is a coalesced form of energy. That energy isn't just the normal way we understand it. This hard matter here is a coalesced form of energy. How much energy is coalesced into matter? This equation tells us. It equals the amount of matter, according to a big number, c, speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, or about 300,000 kilometers per second, squared. That multiplied by itself. So there's a lot of energy coalesced into matter. We find that out, of course, with nuclear weapons when we release quite a bit of it. But the most important thing to remember is that it also means matter can be converted into energy, which is just another form of the same thing, energy, and energy can be converted into matter. Why? Because they're just two different forms of the same thing. Now, to use an analogy you can all understand, what is this thing dangling from the end of my wrist? Okay, it's not a trick question. What is it? It's a hand. This hand is not nothing. This hand is something. But the something called a hand can exist in two different forms. It can exist in this form, fingers outstretched and wiggling, like energy as we normally know it. But it can also transform into this form, a fist. A fist is still a hand. It's just a hand in a different form. And it can hang around for a while, like that proton, and then it can go back into its other form, an extended fingers form. But from beginning to end, there's always something there. It's simply changing from one form into another, and then changing back again. That would be by far the simplest explanation, because you see, at the subatomic level, there's always energy in the environment. And at the subatomic level, apparently, it can coalesce into a proton, just another form of energy. They would be able to have to prove, and I don't even think it is provable by any experimental method we know of, that when there's absolute exclusion of any energy, a proton still appears literally from nothing, not just coalescing from available energy in the system. They'd have to prove that. He didn't even mention that this is the most obvious, logical, simple explanation which does not violate the law of cause and effect, which does not violate the first law of thermodynamics. We don't need this exotic, throwing away proven laws in order to believe something they want to believe at all costs. Full disclosure would point out, well, this would be the simplest explanation, but we jolly well don't want to believe that because we want to get rid of God, and we need to have an example of something coming from nothing. But they don't really, unless they can show it happens when there's no energy available, and they've never proven that. So, Richard Dawkins put it this way. He said, the fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing, some 10 billion years after the universe evolved literally out of nothing, is a fact so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. Well, Dr. Dawkins, please indulge in some madness, because I'd really like to hear the explanation. And it better not be, well, we see protons coming from nothing. No, we don't, not unless you can prove there's no energy there. It's an invalid example. Now, what example do you have? Oh, well, I'd be mad to try to do us justice. What a convenient cop-out. They have no valid explanation. Now, Stephen Hawking said the laws of evolution, I'd like to know where they're listed and what they are. Evolution is just a theory. How can it have laws? But he claims it because he's famous. The laws of evolution can also determine the initial state. The universe can spontaneously create itself out of nothing. A child could refute this. Nothing can create itself because before it existed, there's nothing there, and nothing has no substance, it doesn't exist, and non-existence can't cause anything, especially itself, since itself does not exist. A child could understand that. Our brilliant scientists apparently cannot. Then he said, because there is a law such as gravity, of all things, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. Well, first of all, I want to point out that the real laws that deal with whether something can be created out of nothing is the first law of thermodynamics, and it decisively says it cannot. It's not the domain of the law of gravity. But here again, it's like if you don't believe my proton argument, which we shouldn't, I have this other argument, because there is a law such as gravity, we can get everything from nothing. There are so many logical fallacies here. Is gravity nothing? No. It may be invisible, you can't see it, touch it, taste it, or smell it, but if you jump off a tall building, you'll find out it's so real, it will kill you. It's not nothing, it's something with the power to kill you if you disrespect it. So he's saying if we have something, not nothing, a law, then we can get everything from nothing. But it gets worse. Laws don't come from nothing, they have to come from a lawgiver. So you not only have to have the law, you have to have the lawgiver to put it there and sustain it, and then the law doesn't even really have any effect unless you have something else. What's that? Mass. Objects with mass cause the law of gravity to operate. So if you have three things, the lawgiver, the law, and mass to make it operate, then you can get everything from nothing so long as you have these three things. Yeah, you know, we weren't born yesterday, and you're insulting our intelligence, sir. I don't care the fact that you're famous, you know. If you're spouting nonsense, I'll call bologna sausage on it, okay? So, it's not the domain of the law of gravity. It's not coming from nothing if you have to have the law and mass and a lawgiver to put it there in the first place. Then he says, here's the real honesty of where he's really coming from. He doesn't have any valid arguments, but he does have this belief. He says, there have been various ideas, but for me, the most attractive is that the universe was spontaneously created out of absolutely nothing. Well, just because you yearn for that and desire it and it's most attractive to you does not logically, ergo, make it scientific truth or fact or even logical at all. It's just an emotional attraction to a false religion. Then he says there is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on nothing but authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Wait a minute here, it's a little hypocritical. You just told us everything came from nothing with not a single valid explanation that we can't easily tear apart logically and intellectually and scientifically. So you're basing your argument on your authority as a famous scientist, we should just believe you. I'd like to know what observation and reason you really have to believe everything came from nothing, because so far you haven't given us anything of substance. He's doing the very thing that he claims we're guilty of. You just blindly believe in the authority of the Bible. Well, no, we have good reason to believe the Bible is divinely inspired. We have good reason to believe it makes more sense to believe in a creator than everything came from nothing, for crying out loud. I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black, or utter hypocrisy. This is it, in the extreme. Now, this excellent little DVD by Ray Comfort, he went to major universities, interviewed first the students, and said, just give me the one proof, if evolution is such a fact, what's the one proof that's most convincing that absolutely settles the case evolution is a fact? And they couldn't figure it out. They said, well, there's many. He says, well, then there must be one. What's the main one? What is it? Well, they couldn't give him one. But they said, oh, if you go to our professors, they know. So he went to 4 of the major evolutionist professors in our country today, and they also couldn't give him a good, solid answer. It's a really interesting video to watch. I think it's on YouTube also. But if they were pressed, what would they have said? The same old fallacy of logic. We are in the majority. Argumentum ad populum. We, the majority of scientists, say so. Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Lawrence Krauss, Paul Davies, Richard Dawkins, we all agree as the majority that it's so, and that makes it so. That's the best they have to offer, a textbook fallacy of logic, not real science, not real truth. Now, in this Discovery Channel episode, How the Universe Works, the series, they said, it's one of the biggest hurdles to understanding the Big Bang. First, you have to buy into the premise that something was created out of nothing. Notice you can't be a conscientious objector. Well, maybe I'll believe God used the Big Bang, but you know, I can't quite believe everything came from absolutely nothing. And really, the evolutionists are the only ones who believe in creation ex nihilo, which in Latin means creation out of nothing. God is something. He's not nothing. His creation out of his eternal transcendent power is not everything coming from nothing, it's coming from him. What we would call creation ex deo, creation out of God, an adequate cause. Only the evolutionists believe in this nonsense of creation ex nihilo, that everything literally came from nothing that ever existed. But they say you've got to buy into that if you want to believe science and be a Big Bang theorist and have the respect of the scientific community. Then they say, understanding how nothing turned into something may be the greatest mystery of our universe. I'd agree with that. But if you understand that, you start to understand the Big Bang. Well, I must confess, I will never understand the Big Bang. because if I have to believe everything came from nothing, kiss my brains goodbye, forget about proven laws of science, I'm just not going to go there. So they figure at the end, if they just say it authoritatively, that settles it, because after all, they're the authorities, argumentum ad authoritatem, if they say so, it makes it true. So at the end they say, at the dawn of time, the universe explodes into existence from absolutely nothing into everything, as if saying it makes it so. Well, New Scientist magazine put it this way. They said, why does the universe exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Perhaps the Big Bang was just nothingness doing what comes naturally. Well, making a quaint, trite statement like that may be funny, but it sure doesn't sound scientific to me. Now, Paul Davies, in his book, The Edge of Infinity, he said, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. Well, I'd definitely say it was a miracle, and it takes a whole lot more faith to believe that miracle than any of the miracles I believe in the Bible. So, big fallacies here. First of all, he says there were laws, but then somehow they got suppressed, or we have the suspension. So laws did exist, but then they got suspended. And then we have lawlessness, but somehow from lawlessness, we get laws now. Violation of the law of cause and effect. How can lawlessness produce laws or do anything? You know, if you give these fellows enough rope, just let them talk. They will hang themselves logically every time. And I'd like to ask, why is this more scientific than in the beginning God created? In the beginning God created is in accord with the primary law of all science, the law of cause and effect, because a miracle is perfectly scientific if you have an adequate cause, namely a miracle-working God, for which we have ample scientific and logical argumentation and his appearance in history as a matter of fact. So in conclusion, we find that something eternal caused the space-time matter continuum of this universe to come into existence. There are two options to choose from. An eternal, omnipotent creator which explains everything, from the tiniest, most mundane to the most huge in the universe, the most sublime. It explains everything with no problem at all. Or you can believe, like Stephen Hawking and so many others, that eternal, impotent nothing, that which does not exist, created everything. Ironically, they'll go for this option and ignore the obvious logical and scientific truth that there must be a creator, and it's so obvious, as the scripture says, men are without excuse if they reject it. Well, in the conclusion of his first episode here, Did God Create the Universe?, Stephen Hawking said this: "It's my view that the simplest explanation is there is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate. This leads me to a profound realization. There is probably no heaven and no afterlife either." Wow. You know, more than 90% of the people in the world believe in some kind of an afterlife. The Bible says God has put in our hearts eternity. He's put eternity in our hearts. We know, as in our conscience, that we are eternal creatures. We will be everlasting. We had a beginning, unlike God, but we will last forever. In that sense, we will be eternal. And to say, well, sorry, we came from nothing, your purpose is nothing, when you die, you go to oblivion, you'll never remember you ever existed or achieved anything, you get nothing. Who would want to believe that? Unless there was unreproachable scientific facts and truth and logic that forces you to believe such a philosophy of hopelessness and despair. I would not want to believe it. But somehow, he thinks that's great. I'm glad I've been able to contemplate the cosmos. Well, why are you glad? When you die, you won't remember you ever contemplated anything. You won't remember you ever existed or achieved anything. You know, it's so sad. He was married to this Christian woman, and at one time in her biography of her life with Stephen Hawking, she said, "Stephen, why can't you just stand up," you know, figuratively, because I don't think you could stand at that time, "but why don't you just stand up and tell the world, I believe in God? Is that such a horrible thing?" And he said, "Oh, what would my professional colleagues think of me if I said something like that? Oh, I'd be so ashamed. It would be reprehensible. Oh, I couldn't stand the ridicule." Well, unfortunately, like the Pharisees, who Jesus indicted and said, you know, your problem is you love the praise of men more than the praise of God. You know, the praise of man won't be worth one plug nickel on the judgment day. The praise of God will be worth everything. And this man has tremendous fame and fortune. He has what a lot of people are seeking in this life. But all the fame and fortune in the world can't buy your way into heaven. And it sure can't buy your way out of hell. So in the ultimate sense, it has no value at all from the eternal perspective. To sell your eternal destiny for the praise of man is to shortchange yourself terribly. And so I ask you to pray for this man. He surely does not have much time left. He can't hardly even communicate anymore. The ALS is so bad, even the muscles in his face that he would twitch to try to communicate aren't hardly working anymore. So let's pray that he'll come to his senses. And Jesus died for him as much as anyone else. He could have a new body. No more sorrow, no more sickness, no more pain, no more tears, no more curse, no more death. He could be dancing a jig in an eternal, healthy body for all eternity as a royal son of the King of the universe if he had just humble himself and admit the truth. So let's indeed pray for him. Now, I would rather listen in conclusion to a scientist who has, in my view, a whole lot more logic behind his argument, the famous Blaise Pascal, who was one of the greatest Renaissance philosophers and mathematicians, the father of the modern science of hydrostatics, and considered a contributing founder of the science of hydrodynamics, and a pioneer of probability mathematics. Now, in the 1600s, in the late Renaissance age, there was a lot of atheism resurging in France, and he had a lot of atheist friends. He befriended sinners, just like Jesus did, hoping to lead them to the truth. And his atheist friends loved to gamble. They said, oh, Blaise, we hear you're working on calculating the odds of chance events. Use this mathematics to help us figure out what games to gamble with so we'll win the most. And Blaise said, I'll tell you, my friends, the best way to win at gambling is not gamble. The casinos, the houses of gambling, don't have my probability mathematics, but by trial and error, through experience, they have learned what games favor the house and what games favor the gambler, and they are never going to let you have games that favor you. That means the longer you play, you might win now and then, but in the long run, you'll lose a lot more than you ever win. The odds are against you. But he said, why do you care so much about a temporal reward of winning a jackpot or something? He said, if you want to wager, the most important wager the human heart can make is whether or not there is a God who made us and there's life beyond the grave. To make that mistake would be the worst mistake of all. So he formulated this in the famously known Pascal's wager, which states, how can anyone lose who chooses to become a Christian? If when he dies, there turns out to be no God and his faith was in vain, he has lost nothing. In fact, he has been happier in life than his non-believing friends. If, however, there is a God and heaven and hell, then he has gained heaven, and his skeptical friends will have lost everything in hell. Now, the logic of Pascal's wager is really inescapable. He's saying if you atheists are right, you're guaranteed losers. If you're right, there is no God, there is no afterlife. When you die, you lose everything, including your consciousness that you ever existed or achieved anything or won anything gambling or anything else. It's lost completely. You might as well have not existed because neither you nor anyone else will ever remember you ever did exist. So what purpose was your existence? You lose everything if you're right when you die. But if you're wrong and there is a God who loved you and died for you and wanted you to be a royal member of his family and you shunned and rejected him, then you lose even worse because you'll be excluded from his presence. The very essence, the very definition of hell is to be excluded from the one who is the source of everything that's beautiful and loving and good. The ultimate deprivation is to be isolated from him who is the source of everything that's good. That means you will have deprivation of all good. What a horrible thing. He's basically saying, why stake your eternal existence on a wager where you're guaranteed to lose if you're right and you lose worse if you're wrong? It's lose-lose any way you want to look at it. You put your faith in Christ, if you're wrong, you're not going to lose any worse than anybody else. You really have nothing to lose. But man, if you're right, and there's good reason to believe he was right, because he did fulfill prophecy, he did do the miracles, he did rise from the dead, and the evidence supports that if you'll just take an honest look at it, then you gain everything for eternity. Why risk your life on a lose-lose wager when you could put your faith in Christ, where you have nothing to lose and everything to gain if you're right? The logic is inescapable, and I hope if you have not taken Pascal's wager, that you'll do it before it's too late. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it very much.